The people of Ogoni Land in the River State faced challenges during the Nigerian military regime. They were an ethnic minority in Nigeria in the Niger Delta, targeted for crude oil extraction and have suffered extreme environmental damage from decades of indiscriminate petroleum waste dumping. Ken Sarowiwa, whose hometown was the same Ogoni Land, began devoting most of his time to human rights and environmental causes, particularly in the land settled by the Ogoni people. He was one of the earliest members of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, MOSOP, which advocated for the rights of the Ogoni people. The Nigerian activist Kenule, or Ken Sarowiwa, was born on October 10, 1941 in Bori, a small town in the Niger Delta. His father, Jim Wiwa, was a chief of the Ogoni people, an ethnic minority in the Delta region. He was married to Maria Saro-Wiwa, and they had 5 children who lived with their mother in the United Kingdom while their father stayed in Nigeria. Sarowiwa spent his childhood in an Anglican home and eventually proved himself to be an excellent student. He received primary education at a native authority school in Bori, then attended secondary school at the Government College Umuahia. At Umuahia, he was the only student from Ogoni Land, and fellow students were mandated to speak English, which made Sarowiwa feel Nigerian. He embraced the language as a useful way to communicate with a larger audience at home and abroad. As a distinguished student, he was captain of the table tennis team and amassed school prizes in history and English. On completion of secondary school education, he obtained a scholarship to study English at the University of Ibadan. At Ibadan, he plugged into academic and cultural interest. He won departmental prizes in 1963 and 1965 and worked for a drama troupe. In the mid-1960s, he was a graduate assistant at the University of Nigeria and later moved on as an assistant lecturer at the University of Lagos. He received the honorary title Saro, meaning eldest son, after the Nigerian Civil War. Sarowiwa was there when the Civil War began in 1967, and for the duration of the war, he supported the Nigerian opposition to the Biafrans. During the Civil War in 1967 to 1970, he was a civilian administrator for the port of Bori, near Ogoni in the Niger Delta. He went on to be a businessman, novelist, and television producer. His long-running satirical TV series, Bassi and Co., was purported to be the most watched soap opera in Africa. However, his most respected work was Soza Boy, a novel in the Rotten English, which is a blend of pidgin and idiomatic English. This highly acclaimed novel tells the story of a native village boy recruited to the army during the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970 and intimates the political corruption and patronage in Nigeria's military regime of the time. In the 1970s, Sarowiwa began devoting most of his time to human rights and environmental causes, particularly in the land settled by the Ogoni people. He was one of the earliest members of the MOSOP, known as Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, which advocated for the rights of the Ogoni people. Initially as a spokesperson and then as president of the MOSOP, Sarowiwa led a non-violent campaign against environmental degradation of the land and waters of Ogoni Land by the operations of the multinational petroleum industry, especially the Royal Dutch Shell Company. He criticized the Nigerian government for the reluctance to enforce environmental regulations on the foreign petroleum companies operating in the area. The Ogoni Bill of Rights, written by MOSOP, set out the movement's demands, including increased autonomy for Ogoni people, a fair share of the proceeds of oil extraction, and remediation of environmental damage to Ogoni lands. He devoted himself full-time to the causes of the Ogoni, a minority ethnic group that numbered about 500,000 people. In mid-1992, he broadened the reach of the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, an organization he led. In particular, he focused on Britain, where Shell had one of its headquarters. He criticized the destructive impact of the oil industry, the main source of Nigeria's national revenue. He was imprisoned for several months without trial by the Nigerian military government. Also, he was vice chairman of the Unprecedented Nations and Peoples Organization, UNPO General Assembly from 1993 to 1995. UNPO is an international non-violent and democratic organization of which MOSOP is a member. Its members are indigenous peoples, minorities, and under-recognized or occupied territories that have joined together to protect and promote their human and cultural rights, preserve their environments, and find non-violent solutions to conflicts that affect them. In January 1993, Sarowiwa gathered 300,000 Ogoni to march peacefully to demand a share in oil revenues and some form of political autonomy. MOSOP also asked the oil companies to begin environmental remediation and pay compensation for past damage. He was arrested again and detained by Nigerian authorities in June 1993, but was released after a month. Sarowiwa had been denied entry to Ogoni Land on the day of the brutal murder of the 4 Ogoni chiefs on May 21, 1994. But he was arrested and accused of inciting them. He denied the charges but was imprisoned for more than a year before being found guilty and sentenced to death by a specially convened tribunal. The same happened to 8 other MOSOP leaders who, along with Sarowiwa, became known as the Ogoni 9. On November 10, 1995, Sarowiwa and the rest of the Ogoni 9 were taken from the army base where they were being held to Port Harcourt prison. They were told that they were being moved to Port Harcourt because it was feared that the army base that they were being held at might be attacked by Ogoni youths. The prison was heavily guarded by riot police and tanks, and hundreds of people lined the streets in anticipation of the executions. After arriving at Port Harcourt prison, Sarowiwa and the others were headed into a single room, and their wrists and ankles were tackled. They were then led one by one to the gallows and executed by hanging, with Sarowiwa being the first. It took 5 tries to execute him due to faulty equipment. His last words were, "Lord, take my soul," but the struggle continues. After the executions, the bodies were taken to the Port Harcourt cemetery under armed guard and buried. His execution provoked international outrage and resulted in Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth of Nations for over 3 years. The Ken Sarowiwa Foundation was established in 2017 to work towards improved access to basic resources such as electricity and the internet for entrepreneurs in Port Harcourt. The association founded the Ken Junior Award, named for Sarowiwa's son, Kenule, who died in October 2016. The award is being presented to innovative startup technology companies in Port Harcourt.